So hopefully everyone got a chance to finish the exercise. Now, if you didn't, that's perfectly fine as well. You can always attempt this again at some other point. Context API is going to be around because it is part of the core React features, and it looks like in some ways the team is definitely going to try and flesh it out after getting a bit of feedback from the community about how it's being used. Now, we are just going to finish up with this exercise by removing Redux from our application, just so that we can see what it's like to not have Redux as well. And even then, the Redux portion of our application consists of such a small part now that it's very easy to pull out. After that, I'm going to share with you some of my final parting thoughts about Context API versus Redux for handling local state, and the pros and cons of both, because they do kind of both solve the same problem. And it's rare that you'll want to use an application that has two ways of storing local state, because this kind of removes the idea of a single direction of data flow and one single source of truth. So I'll talk about that more a little later. Let's first just get rid of Redux in our application. Now, inside of our index.js, the main place that actually is utilizing Redux is inside of this provider component. So if we get rid of this component, we're technically removing any instance of Redux from our components. Now, if we get rid of this persister, persistgate, we don't need these anymore either, because this persister is for our Redux. Now, you might have noticed that now whenever our page refreshes, we're no longer able to actually keep track of our state. Therefore, all the items that we added to our cart disappear. Well, this is expected because we were leveraging Redux persist in order to store it in local storage. Now, of course, you can probably implement a similar solution manually using our Context API, but it's definitely more verbose and you have to write the service yourself. So that's another one of the positives of Redux, is that the community has fleshed out pretty good solutions for solving a lot of these problems that are really battle tested that we kind of just pulled in. But now that we've removed Redux from our index.js, we can simply delete our Redux folder. And now the application will pretty much work the exact same. Because Redux has now been removed, our application and our code, nothing leverages it anymore. And we can do a quick search if we look for connect. We don't see any search fields with connect here. And now, if we go back to our application, we'll actually see that everything still works the same. We no longer, of course, have our logger either, right? But this is not really a problem because everything is working. We're able to add our cart, and we are able to check out our total, and we can see it. We can toggle this, and then we can delete these things, all using our new Context API. Now, if you're having issues with this exercise, right, of course, always remember that I have this completed version for you as well inside of our React Context Complete. I'll provide the link for you in your resources. You can always just clone this down and compare it to your solution when you're trying to solve this. But Context API is really easy in that sense, right? It's definitely way less verbose to write than Redux. And that's probably the biggest benefit that Context API provides. It's a really lightweight solution when it comes to local storage management versus something like Redux, which is very opinionated in how it needs to be set up. Now, the con of Context API is that what we trade for in terms of getting this efficiency and ease of use, we trade the flexibility of the Redux ecosystem. So we lose sagas, we lose thunks, right? We lose being able to handle asynchronous actions inside of our Redux middlewares. And what else we lose is the recomposability of our components. Because before, we were using our higher order component connect to connect our components to the respective selectors and the map state to props, as well as the map dispatch to props, that gave us the ability to trigger different things in our components, which made them way more reusable. For example, we were able to trigger different things and use our header component possibly multiple times before because we were passing those values in through our map state to props. That map state to props would select from different slices of our reducers, right, of our overall store. And that was how we were able to possibly just switch out the selectors and reuse this one header component, and the header could be reused in multiple places. The problem with Context API is that we've now tightly coupled what our component needs. So for example, our header component now is not reusable anymore because our header component is tightly coupled to using both the hidden as well as the current user properties inside of the component itself. So that's the one big thing about Context API, is that it's very tightly coupling our components with the specific contexts that it needs. You can't just swap out the context some way. And even if you do by passing them in, it's the wrong way of writing your code, right? If you were to say pass in the context as possibly a props, and then just swapping it out inside of the use context places, that's not a good pattern. Definitely don't do that. The other thing we have to keep in mind as well is that in order for us to properly fully leverage this pattern, we have to write this new provider wrapping pattern that I showed you in the last few lessons, if we needed the entire application to have access to whatever context. But this gets also really verbose as our application grows, because we got to wrap more and more providers in order for our application to have access to all the things that it needs. Whereas with Redux, it's just one provider, and then it separates out all of the stores, right, into their own individual reducers that we build separately, which gives us better separation and easier to read index.js file. So what is the context? That's a pun right there. What's the best use case for Redux versus Context API? Well, when your application you know is going to be large, you probably want to use Redux because the ecosystem is fleshed out and it gives you so much more power and flexibility, including all of the asynchronous event handling and the ability to reuse your components in a much better way. So in that case, with a larger scale application that has a lot of complexity and features and reusable components that when you look at it, you know you're going to reuse a lot of the components you're going to write, definitely go with Redux. If instead you're building, say, like a portfolio project or a portfolio itself or a landing page, something that doesn't have that much reusability and is a pretty small project, maybe even small to medium sized, Context API is great because you don't have to bring in Redux. You don't have to write all these new files and folder structures for Redux, and you can pretty much just start using it right away. So that's my thoughts on context. Of course, context will grow, right? Because it is still a pretty new feature as of this course's release. There's a very high likelihood that the React team will continue pushing context and modifying it so that it becomes more in line with how the developer community as a whole needs to leverage it. So keep an eye out on it. You can use it definitely in your smaller projects and your personal projects if you want to, but they're all tools. That's the main thing to keep in mind. Redux, Context API, they're both tools that solve problems, and they both have their pros and cons and trade-offs. You just have to know when to use what. So with that in mind, I hope you go forth and build some stuff with context, use context, watch these videos, practice with these exercises that I've given you, and I'll see you in the next lesson.